The walnut plank had been fighting me all morning. I had it clamped to the bench at Sycamore and Salt. That's what I'd named the studio, after the street it sat on in East Nashville, and I was running the hand plane along the grain in long, patient strokes, listening for the sound that meant I'd hit the right depth. Walnut talks when you work it correctly. It gives a low, satisfied hiss, and the shaving curls up clean. When you push against the wood instead of with it, you get chatter, resistance, a surface that looks right but won't hold a finish. I had been doing this long enough to know the difference. The phone buzzed against the leg vise. I ignored it. Then it buzzed again, and I saw it was my father, which meant I could not ignore it. So I set the plane down on its side the way Micah had taught me, never flat on the sole. You'll ruin the blade, and picked up. Sandra, my father said, I can't walk you down the aisle on Saturday. 6 words. He used 4 more to explain, but those 6 were the ones that landed, and the rest were just the sound a man makes when he is trying to soften something that cannot be softened. He said something about the grandchildren. He said something about it being complicated. I watched a shaving curl off the end of the bench and drift to the floor. Okay, I said. I want you to understand that this isn't. I have to finish this plank, Dad. I hung up and picked up the plane. The walnut gave me that low hiss on the next pass, and I ran out the length of the board 3 more times before I set the tool down and stood in the quiet of the studio. Through the high windows, the October light was coming in sideways, the way it does in the fall in Nashville, turning everything amber. On the shelf above my workbench sat a small oak box, dovetailed at the corners, that Micah had made me the first Christmas James and I were together. He'd burned the word Sycamore into the lid with a hot iron. I used it to store my card scrapers. I looked at it for a moment, then I picked the plane back up and kept working. My mother called 10 minutes later. I was sweeping shavings when the phone lit up, and I answered it because not answering would have made the next 3 days harder. Your father spoke to you, she said. It was not a question. He did. I want you to know that the situation with Sabrina is very delicate right now, and your father made the most. She paused, and I heard her selecting the word carefully the way she selected everything. The most pragmatic choice available to him. Pragmatic. I set the broom against the wall and walked to the side door of the studio, which opened onto a small concrete step that faced the alley. The air outside smelled like leaves and distant exhaust. I'm sure he did, I said. You'll still have a beautiful wedding, Sandra. You can walk alone. Lots of brides walk alone now. It's actually quite. I need to go, Mom. I sat on the concrete step for a while after I hung up. Not long. The alley was empty except for a tabby cat that crossed without looking at me. I thought about Sabrina, who had 2 children she used like chess pieces, and a marriage I'd watched crumbling over 4 years of Sunday dinners. Her husband Neil going quieter with every passing season, her voice filling the space his silence left, a little louder each time, a little more insistent on being the one the room turned toward. I had watched it at Christmas 2 years ago. Neil getting up from the table before dessert and not coming back for 40 minutes, and Sabrina not missing a beat, just talking over his empty chair while my parents nodded and my father laughed at something she said. And I sat there cutting my pie into small, even pieces, and saying nothing because there was nothing to say that would land. I didn't cry on the step. I thought about it. I noticed the urge the way you notice a drafty window, you register it, you note where it's coming from, and then you get up and find something to seal it with. I drove home and pulled up the driveway and sat for a minute looking at the front garden, which I'd put in myself over 2 summers. Salvia and black-eyed Susans against the fence, a rosemary bush that had gotten out of hand in the best way, a row of ornamental grasses along the walk that moved in the October wind like they were considering something. James's truck was not there. He had a job in Donelson, a renovation on a 1940s bungalow. He did structural work, the bones of buildings, the load-bearing parts that nobody sees until they fail, and he wouldn't be back until evening. I made soup. I deadheaded the salvia. I answered 2 emails about the kitchen table commission that was currently consuming the back third of my studio. At 7:30, James came home, still in his work clothes, and we ate at the counter because the dining table had been claimed by delivery paperwork, and at some point I told him plainly, what my father had said. He listened without interrupting. He ate. When I finished, he set his spoon down and looked at me for a moment, and then he said, "What do you want to do?" Not I'll call him, not that's insane, not a reassurance or a rescue, one question. It was one of the things I had understood about James George from very early on. He did not solve problems you hadn't asked him to solve. He was a structural man. He knew which walls were load-bearing and which ones you could open up. He waited to be told which was which. I said I didn't want to walk alone. I said I didn't want to make it into something it didn't need to be. I said I didn't want my father to feel, from across the church, that he had broken anything that couldn't be put back together, because I wasn't sure that was even true, and I needed to be honest with myself about that. James said, "My dad would do it." I knew he was right before he finished the sentence. I had known it somewhere below the level of thought since the moment my father's voice came through the phone, since the word pragmatic came out of my mother's mouth. I had known it the way you know which joints will hold. The next morning I drove to Franklin. Micah George lived in a house on a dead-end road outside of town, a yellow clapboard house with a detached garage that he had converted, over the course of 15 years, into the kind of workshop that makes people stand in the doorway and not want to move. Lathes, bandsaws, a drill press he'd had since the 70s, a workbench longer than my car. The smell of shavings and linseed oil so deep in the wood of the walls it would outlast the building. He was at the lathe when I got there, turning a bowl from a piece of cherry. He saw me through the side window and shut the machine off and came to the door. "Sandra girl," he said. That was his phrase for me. He'd been using it since the first Thanksgiving I'd spent with James's family, when I'd spent most of dinner out here with Micah. Talking about wood grain and grain direction, and the difference between what a piece of wood wanted to be and what you were trying to make it into. He had never treated me like a guest in that workshop. He had handed me tools. I said, "My father isn't going to walk me down the aisle on Saturday. I want to know if you will." He looked at me. He reached up and turned the lathes overhead light off out of habit, the way you cap a glue bottle before a conversation. "Yes," he said. That was all. No questions about my father, no expressions of outrage on my behalf, no suggestions about how the situation might still be repaired. Just yes, delivered like a measurement, like a piece of information that had been waiting to be confirmed. I drove back to Nashville and went to the studio and worked until 8. Me called Thursday morning. Me Wilson had been my best friend for 11 years, since we'd ended up adjacent in a 2-person ceramics studio during a 6-month period when I was learning what I didn't want my business to be. And she had handled every logistical problem in my life since then with the same flat efficiency she brought to everything else. "Your sister knows," she said. "How?" "Your cousin posted something vague on Facebook and Sabrina called your mom, and your mom confirmed it to manage the narrative. Your dad called James's phone twice this morning." I was at my workbench, marking out the joinery for the commission piece. I set the marking gauge down. "What did James say?" "Didn't pick up. James told me to tell you that his phone is at the bottom of his bag and he hasn't checked it." "What does Sabrina want?" "What does she always want?" Me said. "She wants to be the one who fixes it. She wants to call you and have a conversation and come out of it having put something right. The thing is, there's nothing for her to put right, so the conversation would just be her talking." "Yes," I said. "Your parents are coming to the wedding. Your mother decided." This I had expected. My mother would not absent herself from an event that people would discuss afterward. Attendance was information. Attendance said, "We are still a family, nothing has been severed, the shape of things is intact." My mother understood the optics of presence the way I understood the optics of wood. You could use them to tell whatever story you wanted if you were careful about what you showed. "Front row or back?" I asked. "Back," me said. "By choice or by arrival time, I don't know." "It doesn't matter," I said, and I picked the marking gauge back up. Megan Arnold came to the studio on Friday afternoon. I had known Megan all my life. She had been my grandmother Luce's closest friend, and since Luce had died 3 winters ago, Megan was the person who held whatever Luce had left behind. She was in her mid-80s now, small and deliberate in all her movements, and she arrived in a blue sedan and parked carefully in the alley and knocked on the studio door with her umbrella handle. She had an envelope. It was the kind of paper that goes yellow at the edges when it's been kept somewhere dry and undisturbed for years. My name was on the front in my grandmother's handwriting, which I recognized immediately. It was square and unhurried, the handwriting of a woman who had never felt the need to make herself smaller on a page. Megan put the envelope in my hands and sat down on the stool by the door and didn't say a word. I opened it at the workbench, standing up. Sandra, you are reading this on the day you're getting married, which means you found someone worth marrying, and that pleases me more than I can write down. You were always the one who knew what to do with her hands. You would sit in my kitchen at 7 years old and pick up whatever was there: a spoon, a piece of cloth, a block of wood from the kindling pile, and just turn it over and over until you understood it. That is a way of being in the world that most people never learn. I want to tell you something your parents will not tell you. You were never secondary. You were simply the one who didn't need the room to know your name. There is a difference. Your grandmother on your father's side, you never met her. She was gone before you were born. She was a builder. Not of houses, of things that lasted. She used to say that the only honest work is the work that outlasts the argument about whether it was worth doing. Build things that last, Sandra girl. That's all there is. All my love, Luce. I read it twice. Megan sat on her stool and looked at her hands. After a while she said, "She wrote it the year before she died. She asked me to make sure you had it on the day." I nodded. I folded the letter back into the envelope and set it next to the oak card scraper box on the shelf, and I thanked Megan, and she drove away in the blue sedan. I stood in the studio until the light went completely, and then I locked up and went home. The venue was a converted grist mill outside of Laper's Fork, an hour southwest of the city. The stone walls were 2 feet thick, and the interior smelled, even now, of something ancient and dusty and good. Me had strung lights in the rafters. James's sister had brought in dried eucalyptus and white anemones and arranged them in a way that looked like they'd grown there. The ceremony would happen in the main room where the millstone was. The stone set into the floor like a compass rose, which I had walked across 17 times during the planning visits, and which I intended to get married directly beside. I woke on Saturday at 5:30. The light was just coming up, pewter and thin. I made coffee and took it to the back porch, where I sat on the steps and looked at my garden, which was shutting down for winter the way a workshop shuts down at end of day, everything put away, everything compact, nothing wasted. My phone had 2 messages. One from Micah at 5 a.m. that said only, "Ready when you are, Sandra girl." One from James sent at 5:23, "You built this whole thing. Today you just get to walk through it." I looked at my hands around the coffee cup. They were chapped from the week's work, the knuckles rough, the right palm carrying a callus from the plain handle that had been there for so long I no longer noticed it except in moments like this. The callus was not a flaw. It was evidence. Me arrived at 8. Megan Arnold arrived at 9 and took her seat in the front row early, the yellow envelope visible in her handbag. At 10:30, Micah pulled into the gravel lot in his truck and came through the side door in a dark suit that fit him the way clothes fit a man who is not accustomed to wearing them, but has decided not to argue with the occasion. He had a small piece in his jacket pocket. I found out later it was a wooden disc, turned from the cherry bowl he'd been working on when I came to the workshop, finished overnight and sanded to 300 grit. He gave it to me at the end of the night instead of at the beginning, but that comes later. My family arrived at 10:45 and went to the back. I didn't see them. Me told me after, in the economy of words me always used, "Your parents, your sister, back left." Neil didn't come. I had not expected Neil. I had not expected Sabrina either, but I understood, thinking about it, that she had to be there in the same way my mother had to be there. To absent yourself was to concede something. To attend was to maintain the claim. At 11, I stood in the anteroom with Micah while the music started. James's college roommate on guitar, something quiet and unrecognizable, the way James and I had wanted everything, quiet and specific and ours. Micah offered me his arm and I took it, and he said, "You ready?" "Yes," I said. The barn doors opened onto the millstone room, and the light inside was warm and full, and the eucalyptus smell hit me immediately, green and sharp. We started walking. 50 feet of aisle, stone floor, the faces turning toward us, and at 10 steps and I heard it, a soft, collective intake, the sound of a room registering something it hadn't predicted. I did not look at the back row. I looked at the millstone, and then at James, who was standing at the end of the aisle in the same dark blue suit he'd worn to his brother's wedding 4 years ago, and who looked at me the way he'd looked at me in every hard conversation we had ever had, steadily, without flinching, with his full attention. Micah brought me to the end of the aisle and turned to face me and took both my hands in his for one moment. His hands were warm and very rough, rougher than mine, the hands of 50 years of making things. He squeezed once, brief and complete, and stepped to his seat. The officiant was a friend of ours from the neighborhood, a woman named Carla who had known us both for 6 years and who had agreed to do the ceremony on the condition that she could write her own remarks, which we had said yes to without reservation. In her remarks, she said something about building, about how long things take to build correctly, and how you can always tell the difference between something that was rushed and something that was given its proper time. She quoted Luce's letter without knowing it. I had told James about the letter the night before, and James had told Carla the last line, and Carla had worked it in without attribution. The only honest work is the work that outlasts the argument about whether it was worth doing. James repeated it back to me in his vows. He had written his vows himself, longhand, on an index card he kept in his breast pocket. "I am not building toward you," he said. "I am building with you. That is the difference, and I intend to keep making it." At the reception, my father found me at the drink table. He had aged in the last year in the way that uncertain men age, not harder but softer, less sure of his edges. He held a glass of white wine, and he looked at me and he said, "You looked beautiful up there, Sandra." I said, "Thank you for coming." He opened his mouth to say something more, something I could see was prepared, something he had put together in the car on the way over or in the bathroom mirror before they left the house. Before he could get it out, my mother appeared at his elbow, smooth and immediate, and touched his arm the way you touch an arm to redirect, not to comfort, and said, "Max, there's someone you should say hello to." And she moved him away without looking at me. I poured myself water and went back to James. Monday morning, 6:45. The commission was on the bench, a dining table for a house in Green Hills, white oak, 3 inches thick, 9 feet long. The largest piece I had contracted in 4 years of running sycamore and salt on my own. I had the drawings pinned above the bench, and I was reading them when I heard Micah's truck in the alley. He came through the side door carrying something wrapped in moving blanket. He set it on the clear end of my workbench without ceremony, the way he did everything, as if it were simply the next step in a sequence that had always been obvious. It was a wall cabinet, white oak, to match nothing but to belong anywhere. The joinery was hand-cut, the finish a thin oil that let the grains speak. On the inside of the door he had rooted a small rectangle and filled it with a piece of end-grain walnut, and into the walnut he had pressed 3 letters, S and J, not our initials. Sycamore and James, I understood, or Sandra and James, or both at once. "I started it in August," he said, looking at the commission drawings and not at me. "Didn't know if I'd finish in time." "It's perfect," I said. He nodded once and went a look at the white oak slab, and we talked about the commission for 20 minutes, and then he drove back to Franklin. At noon, my phone buzzed. My father's name on the screen, a text that said, "I've been thinking about everything. I'm going to write you a letter, a real one. I owe you that." I read it. I set the phone face down on the bench. I picked up my marking gauge and made the first mark on the white oak, and the line it left was clean and true and exactly where I had intended it to go. The letter arrived the following Thursday. Handwritten, 6 pages, his recognizable cramped cursive on yellow legal paper. He was honest in it. Not entirely, there were places where honesty ran up against self-preservation and self-preservation won, but more honest than I had expected from him, more honest than I thought he had in him. He wrote about Sabrina's marriage, which was over now in all but paperwork. He wrote about my mother. He wrote, near the end, something that surprised me, I think I always knew the cost of what I did. I just kept hoping you wouldn't present the bill. I read it twice and folded it and put it in the oak box on the shelf, beside Luce's letter. I did not text him back. Sabrina called on a Wednesday 2.5 weeks after the wedding. I was finishing the apron on the commission table, running the router along the underside of the slab, and I set the router down and answered it because I knew I would have to eventually, and it was better to choose the time than to have it chosen. She talked for a while. She said she was sorry. She said she had been under enormous pressure with Neil, with the children, with things I didn't fully understand. She said she hadn't realized how it would look. She said, and this was the partial truth, the thing that was true but incomplete, the thing she offered as if it were the whole, I just needed Dad to come down on my side for once. And I didn't think about you. I listened. When she finished, I said, okay. A pause. She had been expecting something else, a door opened or a door definitively closed, one of the two. I gave her neither. That's all you're going to say, she said. I'm in the middle of something, I said. I'll talk to you another time. I hung up and picked up the router. The white oak gave a low, clear note as the bit moved through it, and the shaving that came up was long and clean and curled at the end like a question that had already answered itself. I set my feet, found the grain, and kept going.